We're rolling.
Welcome to the REI Rookies Podcast.
The Real Estate Investing Rookies Podcast, episode number 104, where we invite you to follow us on our journey towards financial freedom using the power of real estate. I'm Josh Koth.
And I'm Jack Haas.
And here at REI Rookies, we believe in a couple key principles. Number one, the best way to retain information is by teaching it to others. And number two, a rising tide lifts all boats. We're not competitors, we're a community. So let's get into some real estate investing.
So today's podcast was spurred on by a recent email we received from a potential buyer of one of our properties. And she had kind of a list of issues she had with the place. And we just wanted to take a moment to talk about how not to negotiate against yourself.
Right, because sometimes the instinct is to kind of just comply and like, okay, what are we going to do to fix this? How much is this going to cost us? What do we need to do? And you start negotiating, like you said, against yourself because you just think, well, if I was them, I'd want this and this done. So we're going to have to do this, this, and this. And a lot of times you end up conceding or giving up way more than you initially would ever have to. So a good way to, when we were talking about it, we decided, well, let's not email. Let's call and talk it through, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's probably the first tip we can give you here in this episode is let's, in this day and age, our first reaction is going to be an email or a text or something like that. The best situation is actually to make that phone call, so nothing can be misinterpreted or, you have a tendency of reading between the lines when there's nothing there to read. So make that phone call and try to get everybody on the same page first.
Yeah, and then you can, well, for one thing, it's just a lot quicker because you don't have to. If you start exchanging emails, it's going to be 15, 20 emails back and forth before you might rectify the issue. But a phone call, you can usually get it all taken care of in one shot.
That's a really good point because I think a lot of people would assume that a quick email is faster. Mm-hmm. But in the end, what we've definitely have found that a quick phone call is way faster, and it just removes a lot of those barriers.
So when you took this call, or made the call, I should say, how did it go? What was your attitude going in when she had a list of things that, were wrong with the property basically after she had purchased it? And that's kind of an interesting area too, because, obviously when you sell a property like on the MLS, you would never think of contacting the seller with a list of things that are wrong, right? Mm-hmm. So this is more of a rent to own type situation. So they have kind of a little bit more, they think that us as the owners have a little bit more responsibility. So even though we hit them over the head with the fact that they are responsible for the property from the time you sign the documents on, there's kind of an expectation there that we have to deal with. So talk a little bit about how you went into the conversation.
Well, I just actually said that based on the information in her email, I just wanted to get a better idea of what her expectations was and what she'd like to see done. And then shut up and let her go from there.
Right, because if you would have called and said, well, here's what we're willing to do, you may have given up and conceded a lot more than she even wanted. Sometimes people just want to be heard, right? And just listening to the person and seeing what their problems are, sometimes that's almost enough, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you just ask them, okay, what would you like to see happen? Well, sometimes they will ask for the moon, and then you can push back or do whatever. You have your line in the sand that you're willing to go up to and not go past. And so you have to figure that out for yourself in every situation. But you don't want to go right up to your maximum that you were willing to concede to unless you have to, right? Just part of negotiating. So always ask them what they'd like to see happen first. And you're always nice, nurturing, you never want to get defensive. And that's a big part of this too is, you don't want because people get really, heated and emotional about properties, and there could be an expectation that they think the seller was trying to pull one over on them, and really we would never do that. And hopefully most people wouldn't do that. So you got to make sure that is established, that if there's something wrong with a piece of the property or something, that obviously, either you weren't aware of it, or it's just something that you missed or whatever, but there's no malicious intent, and that's important to get across. And I think once both parties understand there isn't malicious intent there, it's a lot easier to get to the finish line.
Yeah, and the way different people communicate too, especially like via email or text. In this case, there's a good chance that I might have misread it. By the way the email was written, it almost seemed accusatory.
Right.
But when I chatted with her, in the end, it ended up being nothing, because she, as you said, she wanted to be heard, and she wanted to let us know everything she's planning on doing. So it was almost more good news for us than how it was initially received.
Yeah, because when you see the email, it's like, okay, here's a list of things that she expects us to pay for. That's how we read it, right?
Yeah.
Because we're putting that expectation on her. And really, that, like you said, that's our fault, because you kind of get your dander up, get defensive. And that really wasn't warranted, because when you spoke with her, really, there's nothing that we're going to end up doing, or nothing that she was really demanding at all. So, it was resolved, and just with a quick phone call. It cost us no money. And hopefully she feels better about the situation, and that there was no malicious intent, and that everybody's on the same page, right? She wants to be in the house. She wants to make some improvements, fix a few things, and we're on board with her doing that, obviously.
Yeah, in one case, she was even simply asking for a recommendation regarding a concrete guy.
So. Yeah, and because a lot of times, especially in a rent-to-own situation, they may have not owned a home previously, so some of this is new, ground for them. They've always had a landlord taking care of repairs, so they're kind of having to explore the world of owning your own home and dealing with this stuff themselves. So obviously they would look to people with experience. So, if we just, that's a good lesson for us. Don't assume malicious intent on the part of the person sending you the email either. So that is a good lesson from that point. So that's kind of one scenario where this came up. And now let's talk about it in just normal negotiating to purchase real estate or sell real estate. So one of the ways that we have learned to never negotiate against yourself is just on the MLS, when you're figuring out what price to offer on a property. And our main point, and the lesson we've learned over and over, is when you figure out a price that you're willing to pay on a property on the MLS, just offer it. Even if it seems super ridiculous, and if you start saying things like, well, they'll never take that, you're negotiating against yourself, because you don't know, especially on the MLS, because you have a buyer's agent typically, and they're communicating with a listing agent. There's a lot of people in between you and the seller, so you really don't have any read on the seller's level of motivation. So in particular on the MLS, do not negotiate against yourself. Just robotically figure out your number and offer it. And it's a numbers game on the MLS, so you have to do that repeatedly before you're going to get any properties under contract.
Yeah, just definitely don't assume motivation. Just because you may not be willing to take that price doesn't mean the receiving person wouldn't consider it.
Yep. Especially if a property's been sitting for a while. I mean, people's motivation changes. Sometimes people get cocky, and we've done this too, where you list things and you think, oh, it's going to sell right away for top dollar. Doesn't happen. It sits there for a while. The market changes a little. 6 months down the road, their motivation is a lot higher than it probably was 6 months earlier, especially if they're waiting on this house to sell before they can move to another one, or they need the money for something else. There's all kinds of scenarios where that motivation will evolve over time. That's why follow-up is so key as well. But the main point is, if you figure out a price, just offer that, and don't ever say to yourself, well, they're never going to take this. And in fact, that's kind of our joke now, is we say, well, they're never going to take this, and then we submit it anyways, because it's kind of the joke. You're right, they probably won't, but we're at least submitting the offer. You did the work. You analyzed the property. So you need to follow through, because if you don't do that last part of the process, which is actually submitting the offer, I guarantee you'll get no properties, because you're not submitting any offers. And it just helps with mindset too. And once you do it enough times, you become comfortable with these, semi-ridiculous offers. They don't start to seem so ridiculous after you've submitted a few hundred of them. They're just kind of normal, everyday, average things.
So let's talk about, talking to the seller directly. In those situations, we're really using a lot of the same questions that I did when we were talking to the buyer. What would you like to see happen? And that's one of probably the most powerful questions you can ask, because then they start to paint a picture for themselves and what they would actually like to see happen. And then you can tailor your offer to match that picture.
Yeah, and when you're talking to a seller directly, you're really at a distinct advantage over offering on the MLS, because you can figure out from the seller what their level of motivation is directly. And if you're really a good trained salesperson, you learn all the right questions to ask and how to uncover what is at the root of that motivation. And really, be almost a consultative approach. Like, how can we handle this together? How can we help you through this? How can we fit into this equation? And maybe one of those ways is selling it to us, maybe not. You can at least explore that directly with the seller, and it gives you a distinct advantage over offering on the MLS, where there's so many people in between you and the seller. And you can really uncover that level of motivation and see what it really is, and see if there's really a deal to be had or not.
And when it comes to this, when it gets to pricing, that's one of the last things we typically talk about. Mm-hmm. But in the end, you kind of want them to come to their own conclusion and their own pricing. And more times than not, if you've done it right and you've taken the time to build that rapport and ask the appropriate questions, many times that they'll come in under what you had originally planned on offering. So let them guide that conversation and let them dictate those rules.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you're going to have to come up with a price and say the number first. But I've definitely asked, after you've had a pretty long conversation uncovering their motivation, I've definitely asked them, what would it take for you to possibly walk away from this property? And sometimes that number is actually lower than we were expecting. So, you don't want to throw your number out there first unless you have to, right? Because that's kind of what they're looking for. So just remember to just ask all the right questions, uncover that motivation, and you're in a unique position if you're talking directly to the seller. So that's a great thing that's positive in your direction.
Well, let's talk briefly about, like, you went and looked at a property just yesterday. Mm-hmm. Where did they start off at? They were asking for, what, 120, 130 or something for it? No,
it was like 85, I think. It's a small town.
That was way off.
Yeah, way off, yep. See, I already talked you down. No, they started at 85, and then, 20 minutes later, we were at 65. And that was with me not saying a thing. I never said a price. And by the time I walked away, we were at 55. And I could have shook on 55, but we were at 50. So, I was basically willing to walk away over the $5,000, and was hoping that, he would maybe come my way by the end of the day after he thought about it for a while. Hasn't happened yet. It still could happen. I mean, we've had it happen many times. When you walk away, they call you a day later. That offer's still good. After they've had some time to let it sink in and really almost talk themselves into it. Because when you walk away, that's pretty powerful.
I think that's one of the biggest mistakes like we made early on is, and I think that's one of the biggest skills that we probably learned, is asking some very basic, direct questions and just letting them talk. Don't convince people into it. They'll do that on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't ask enough questions. That's really what you need to be doing during sales appointments. But, to keep to the topic of the episode, not negotiating against yourself, I just let them talk, and eventually we were down, like I said, we're down to 55 from 85. So that's a pretty significant percentage of price reduction there. So, and I didn't ever think that he'll never get down to that. If I would have went into the appointment thinking, he's at 85, he would never get down to 55. He wouldn't, because my mindset would be such that I wouldn't believe that was possible. So you always have to believe that anything's possible. We've bought properties way, way, way under where we ever thought it was possible to buy them. So you do have to believe that it's possible. And if you do, then sometimes it does actually happen.
So just to kind of wrap things up, our main point here is don't negotiate against yourself, and don't put words in buyers or sellers' mouth. Don't make assumptions, and don't assume motivation.
Yep, and if you put the effort in, throw the offer out there, especially if it's on the MLS.
We put a lot of effort into putting some useful information and content together, and if you've found some value, support us at patreon.com/REIRookies.
If you have any thoughts or questions, shoot us an email at info@reirookies.com. Also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at REIRookies. And if you like what you're hearing, head over to iTunes, subscribe, rate, and review the show. It really helps other rookie investors out there find us.
And remember, get off the bench.
And get into the game. We'll see you next time. This episode is brought to you by FargoTurnkey.com. Do you live in a good cash flowing market? If so, Turnkey isn't the best choice for you. You should buy in your market. If you don't live in a great market for investors, where can you find profitable cash flowing properties? We love the Midwest, where prices are reasonable and the people are great. Ever heard of North Dakota Nice or see the movie Fargo? That's where we live. We personally invest here and have lived here all of our lives. How does Turnkey work? We find the property, we rehab the property, we find you a tenant and place you under the care of our local property manager, who we trust with all our own investment properties. I'm sure you have questions about how the process works and what to do next. If that's the case, fill out the form on FargoTurnkey.com and we'll reach out to see if you are a good fit for our business. We have a limited supply of properties every month, so we can sell only to a few qualified buyers. See you at FargoTurnkey.com.
I don't like to tell a man what to do with his money, but if you ain't investing in property, then you're dumber than a dummy.
I'm not dumb. I'm smart.
Well, buy property. That's my advice.